I'm 16 and in my sophomore year of high school. For security reasons, I'll be keeping both my real name and the name of my school private. I've always been the quiet type, but not someone who likes to stand out either. I don't have a huge group of friends, but I'm close to a few. Most of my time is spent studying, binge-watching TV shows, or listening to music. There's something soothing about being in my own little world, and walking home from school is one of those rare moments when I can just relax and let my mind wander. This happened a few months ago on a Friday. I had this strange feeling that crept over me as I stepped out of the school gates, but I brushed it off reluctantly. I always walk through the park near my house, but that day, I noticed something was off. As I passed by the benches, I saw a man standing off to the side. He wasn't doing anything suspicious at the time, just standing there, looking down the street. But then he turned to look at me. When our eyes met, there was something about his gaze that unsettled me. I stopped looking at him and kept walking, but when I glanced back, he was still staring, his eyes fixed on me. Feeling terrified, I immediately quickened my pace. It wasn't until I turned the corner onto my street that I felt a slight sense of relief. I was almost home when everything went black. I woke up hours later, my head throbbing. My hands were bound to a chair and I couldn't move. The cold, damp floor beneath me made me shiver and panic set in. With the facts that I don't know where I was and how I had gotten there, I became petrified. I tried to scream, but the cloth shoved into my mouth muffled the sound. My heart raced in terror. This wasn't just some bad dream. This was real. At that moment, I heard the echo of footsteps drawing closer. The door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. His face was hidden behind a dark mask. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, staring at me. I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unfeeling, as though he was studying every inch of me. "Please, let me go," I mumbled. But he didn't respond. He just pulled out a phone, checked it, and then turned his attention back to me. The man's eyes glimmered with something that made my blood run cold. He wasn't just here for me. He knew who I was, and that was far worse than I could have ever imagined. After a few minutes, he left. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. I wasn't sure. I struggled against the ropes, but they were too tight. It wasn't until later, when my panic began to give way to sheer survival instinct, that I realized the ropes weren't tied well. They were loose enough for me to break free with enough persistence. And luckily, I broke free after several trials. Just as I broke free, I ran without thinking, driven by nothing but panic. Fortunately, I found myself headed toward an exit I wasn't even sure was an exit. It was a small rusted door that opened into an alleyway. It was still daylight, the harsh sunlight making me squint as I stumbled out. The alley was quiet, tucked away from the main street, and the air felt strangely still. There were no people around, just the distant hum of traffic. I didn't dare stop. I kept running, putting as much distance as possible between myself and whatever nightmare I had just escaped. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I ran. I had no idea where I was heading, but I knew I couldn't slow down. As I turned a corner, I stumbled onto a busy street. My legs were almost giving out, and I could barely breathe. My vision was blurry, but I saw a figure, a woman, walking on the sidewalk. She noticed me immediately. Maybe it was the panic in my eyes or the way I was clutching at my clothes, but she stepped closer, sensing something was wrong. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice sharp and filled with concern. Her eyes scanned me quickly, noticing the state I was in. My body was shaking, and I was covered in dirt and bruises from the struggle. Before I could speak, she pulled out her phone and dialed. "I need help," she said firmly into the phone, giving details about the situation. She told the dispatcher to send the police immediately. And the next thing I knew, I was sitting in the back of a squad car, trembling uncontrollably as officers asked me questions I couldn't even begin to answer. My mind was still processing everything that had happened. The terror of being taken, the unknown of where I'd been, and the fear of what might have happened if I hadn't broken free. We were all surprised when Mr. Keating left so suddenly. He wasn't just a math teacher, he was the math teacher, the one everyone liked, even the slackers. He had a way of making you feel like you could actually solve a problem if you just looked at it differently. So, when we walked into class on Monday and saw someone else at his desk, it threw us off. The man introduced himself as Mr. Lane. He was polite, but something about him felt off. He had this overly rehearsed smile, like he was trying a bit too hard. His first lesson was fine, but he made no effort to connect with us like Mr. Keating had. "Do your work quietly," he said after handing out an assignment. "I'll be at my desk if you have questions." That was it. No jokes, no encouragement, just silence. To be honest, he wasn't bad at teaching at all, but he was distant. He never made small talk or asked us about our lives like Mr. Keating did. And then there were his habits. The way he'd stare out the window every few minutes, or flinch whenever someone opened the classroom door. At first, I thought he was just weird, but weird doesn't explain what I stumbled across one late night on the internet. I'd been scrolling through Reddit when a thread popped up. The title caught my eye. Curious, I clicked. The thread detailed the story of a man accused of brutally murdering a prominent businessman and disappearing without a trace. It was grainy, but I'd recognize that face anywhere. The guy in the picture wasn't just Mark Brown. It was Mr. Lane. At first, I laughed. There was no way my math teacher was a wanted criminal. But the more I read, the more I realized the man in that picture, the murderer, was standing right in front of me every day at school. I couldn't believe it. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, but I was totally sure and convinced it was him. The next day, I found it hard to concentrate in his class. During lunch, I pulled up the article on my phone and showed it to my best friend Liam. "Dude, that's insane," Liam said, squinting at the screen. "It does look like him. You're gonna tell him, right?" "Tell him?" I said, laughing nervously. "What if it is actually him?" "Exactly," Liam whispered. "If he's innocent, he'll laugh it off. If he's not, well, we'll know." By the time math class rolled around, I'd worked up the nerve to confront him. I stayed behind after class, waiting until everyone else had left. My heart was pounding as I approached his desk. "Mr. Lane?" I said, holding up my phone. "Can I ask you something?" He looked up, his face tight with suspicion. "What is it, Tyler?" I handed him the phone, showing him the Reddit thread. "This guy looks a lot like you," I said. For a second, his expression was unreadable. Then he smiled. "That's interesting," he said, handing the phone back. "But no, that's not me. You should be careful about spreading rumors, Tyler," he said, his voice icy. "They can get people in trouble." That night, around midnight, I was scrolling through when I heard a soft knock at the front door. At first, my mind wandered to my parents. Maybe they were back, but it had only been one day since they left. They were supposed to be out of town for a 2-day conference, something about my mom's company hosting a series of meetings. I was literally home alone, so I went downstairs to check. When I peeked through the peephole, my stomach dropped. It was Mr. Lane. I froze. Why was he here, and why at this time? A lot of questions spawned through my mind, but I was sure of one thing. This had to be related to what I had shown him before. And the fact that he was standing at my door, this late at night, meant one thing: he might have bad intentions towards me. I am an intelligent individual, and I'm pretty good at analyzing things. I hesitated for a moment, then I backed away from the door, my pulse racing. I had to stay calm. I needed to think things through. The knock came again, louder this time. "Tyler," he called softly. "I just want to talk." I crept back upstairs, grabbing my phone to call Liam. Before Liam could respond, the knocking turned into pounding. "Tyler, open the door." I paused and said to myself, why was he shouting my name and banging the door like that? Wasn't he concerned my parents might be home? Unless, of course, he knew they weren't. At that moment, I realized I might actually be in danger. I hung up and quickly dialed 911, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained that my math teacher was outside my house, banging on it and meant to harm me. It felt awkward to describe the situation, but I was convinced that's what was happening. And then the pounding stopped. For a moment, I thought he'd left. Then I heard it, the sound of the lock turning. My blood ran cold. He was picking the lock. I scrambled to my bedroom, locked it, and blocked the door with a chair, my hands shaking as I whispered updates to the dispatcher on the phone. At that moment, I could hear the footsteps of him coming in and the unmistakable sound of a gun clicking. My heart dropped as I whispered to the dispatcher, trying to explain that he was inside and had a gun. A loud crash cut me off. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, getting closer. "Tyler," Mr. Lane called. "We need to clear this up." The floor creaked under his weight as he stopped exactly outside my door. I honestly do not know how he was able to just pick out the bedroom I was in. I was losing it already, and I frantically feared for my life at that moment. Then my doorknob jiggled and he began trying to break in. I was so helpless. All I did was press my weight against the chair, praying it would hold. Just as I thought the door would give, I heard the distant sound of sirens. Mr. Lane cursed under his breath and bolted. I stayed barricaded in my room until I heard the police knocking. Luckily, they found him a few blocks away before he could escape. It turned out the Reddit thread was right. His real name was Mark Brown, and he was indeed the man featured in the thread. To this day, I'm grateful I had the sense not to open the door for him, though I can't help but regret ever showing him the article in the first place. Looking back, I realized just how dangerously close I came to becoming one of his victims. If you are not subscribed yet, please make sure you subscribe and turn on the post notification. Your support is greatly needed and appreciated. I had just transferred to Lakeside High, a small school in a quiet town. Starting over wasn't my choice, but when my mom got the new job, we didn't have much say. I figured I'd fly under the radar, make it through the year unnoticed, but things turned out differently. I received a text a week after I started. "Hey Emma, welcome to Lakeside High." It wasn't strange to get a text from someone new. It could have been a classmate who got my number. But the thing was, I hadn't given my number to anyone. I replied, "Who is this?" But there was no response. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then, 2 days later, another message arrived. "You look nice in that blue dress today." I stopped in my tracks, staring at the screen. "Seriously, who is this?" "Stop texting me," I replied. A response came within seconds. "Just a friend, don't be scared." I ignored the last message. The texts became more frequent, more invasive. They'd mention details about my day. "You always sit by the window in history. I get why. It's the best view. Your brother's learning to ride that green bike fast. He's got guts." That last one made my stomach drop. My little brother, Alex, had just gotten the bike for his birthday last week. Whoever this was, they weren't just watching me. They must have followed me home. I went to my parents. My dad brushed it off as a prank, and my mom tried to convince me it was probably some lonely classmate trying to get my attention. One night after a late study session at school, it was a little dark when I left. I had started walking home when my phone buzzed. "You're all alone out here." I froze. My breath hitched as I looked around. I typed back, "Leave me alone." A reply came instantly, "Turn around." I turned around but saw nothing. My fear grew instantly and I decided to run. I took off, my legs pumping harder than they ever had before, my heart pounding in my ears. When I got home, I showed my parents the text and instantly I could see the worry in their eyes. They told me to block the number and they called the police, relaying every detail about what had happened. The next morning I checked my phone and I saw a photo from an unknown number. It was of me, running down the street the night before. I became more terrified. I showed my parents, and immediately they informed the police. But after that, the messages stopped. Weeks went by, and I started to feel normal again. My parents even talked about installing cameras around the house, but nothing came of it. I began to convince myself it was just a cruel joke. Then one night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed. "You think you're safe?" There were photos attached. The first showed me walking home, the second, sitting in class. But the last one was different. It was of me, asleep in my bed. The angle was too close, taken from the foot of the mattress. I screamed, dropping the phone. My parents burst into the room and I showed them the texts. They called the police immediately. This time, they searched the house. Hidden in the vent above my bed, they found a camera. It was obvious this person had found his way into the house and into my room to install the camera. I became petrified. We moved a week later. My parents tried to pretend it was just for convenience, pretending it was closer to my mom's job, but we all knew the truth. Months passed. Life went on, and eventually the memory started to fade. Then, one night, I woke up to a strange noise. It was faint, a soft scraping sound like nails against wood. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. At first, I thought it was my imagination, maybe the wind or a branch brushing against the window. Then I heard it again. The sound was coming from inside the house. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed to my bedroom door, opening it just enough to peer into the hallway. It was dark, but nothing seemed out of place. I crept forward, my bare feet silent against the floor, following the noise. It led me to the living room. The scraping was louder now, rhythmic, coming from the front door. I held my breath as I stepped closer, gripping my phone like it was a weapon. And then the noise stopped. A shadow shifted outside the frosted glass window of the door. My blood turned to ice as I realized someone was standing there. I stumbled back, almost tripping over the coffee table, and bolted for my parents' room. I shook them awake, stammering about the noise and the shadow. My dad grabbed a bat and went to check, while my mom called the police. I stayed behind, heart hammering in my chest. After a few minutes, he came back with a photo he said he found taped to the outside of the door. It was a picture of my family, my mom, my dad, my little brother, and me, taken that very night, through the living room window. When the police arrived, they promised to increase patrols in our neighborhood, which they did. To be honest, that helped ease the situation. We installed cameras, security lights, everything we could think of. It's been years since then, but I still remember it like yesterday. We still do not know what the intentions of that person were. They haven't contacted me again, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting. This happened a few years ago in high school. High school rivalries are supposed to be fun, right? Some good-natured competition, maybe a prank or two. At least, that's what I thought before everything spiraled out of control. It started with me, Sam, and Jack. We'd been at each other's throats since middle school. We didn't hate each other, not really. But the competition was like a fire neither of us could let die. When Jack landed the lead role in the spring play, it was the final straw. Drama wasn't even my thing, but I auditioned just to beat him. I didn't get the lead, but I snagged a role big enough to keep me in his spotlight, and it drove him nuts. That's when the pranks began. My gym clothes vanished, my bike tires were slashed. A bright red loser appeared across my windshield. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind it. I hit back with a rumor, nothing major, just that Jack cheated on a math test. It wasn't long before the whispers started. Jack caught wind of it and stormed into rehearsal one afternoon. "You think this is funny?" he hissed, his face inches from mine. "Careful, Jack," I said with a grin. "You might lose your precious role if you let everyone see you crack." His fists clenched, but he didn't swing. Instead, he walked out and didn't come back. The next day, Jack wasn't in class. It appeared he hadn't arrived home the night before. Soon, news went out. Jack was missing. That day felt like an eternity. The school was filled with whispers, teachers were on edge, and the police had no solid leads. Everyone suspected me, of course, because of the bitter rivalry between Jack and me. But I was innocent. Later that evening, Jack showed up at the police station, out of breath, his clothes torn, and his face pale with fear. The officers who'd been searching for him didn't even recognize him at first. He collapsed in front of them, gasping for air, and it was clear he'd been through something horrific. Jack told the police everything. He revealed that it was Mr. Gordon who had kidnapped him. He described the events leading up to the kidnapping, including how Mr. Gordon had tried to silence him because of an affair with the school's biggest donor's wife. Jack explained how Mr. Gordon had strategically planned the kidnapping to frame our rivalry as the reason for his disappearance. The officers were stunned. They hadn't even considered Mr. Gordon as a suspect, but Jack was certain. He recounted everything in vivid detail, starting with the strange behavior he'd noticed between Mr. Gordon and the wealthy donor's wife. Jack had overheard conversations, asked too many questions, and Mr. Gordon had gotten scared. Jack described being locked in a shed, how Mr. Gordon had threatened him, saying no one could know the truth. The plan had been to make it seem like the rivalry between us had escalated, hoping everyone would think I was behind it all. "I barely escaped," Jack told the police, his eyes wide with horror. "I had to break out." The police quickly took action. Within hours, Mr. Gordon was arrested, his life and career crumbling as the truth came to light. The news spread through the school like wildfire. Teachers, students, everyone. No one could believe what had happened. By the time the police released a statement, the story was all over the local news. The affair, the kidnapping, the lies, it was all there for everyone to see. Mr. Gordon had tried to cover his tracks, but in the end, his desperation and fear of losing everything had led him to make a fatal mistake. The rivalry between Jack and me had always been a source of tension, but we'd never imagined it could go this far. Gordon had used that tension to manipulate everything, thinking he could escape the consequences of his actions. Jack came back to school a week later, still shaken but grateful to be alive. We didn't speak much about what had happened. There were just too many emotions tangled up in it. But I knew, deep down, that we'd both learned something important. It all started when I was 16, a junior in high school. An invitation appeared in my locker, a neatly folded piece of paper with my name written on the front in sharp, precise handwriting. I unfolded it and read the message. "You've been chosen. Meet us in room 309 after school if you want to be part of something extraordinary." At first I thought it was a prank, but the curiosity was too much to resist. Room 309 had been abandoned for years. It used to be a storage space, and no one ever went there. The idea of an exclusive gathering happening in such a forgotten corner of the school piqued my curiosity. After school, I found myself hesitating at the door to room 309. I could hear muffled voices from inside. Taking a deep breath, I knocked. The door creaked open, and I was pulled in by a guy I vaguely recognized from my math class. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single desk lamp. About a dozen students sat in a loose circle, their faces partially hidden by the shadows. One of them stepped forward. Her name was Kara, a senior who was known for her straight-A grades and quiet nature. "We've been watching you," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "We think you have potential to join us." "Join what?" I asked. Kara smiled. "The Society. We're a group of students who look out for each other, protect each other, and help each other succeed. But we keep it under wraps. No one outside this room knows we exist." It sounded harmless enough, a group of students helping each other out. They explained that they shared homework answers, helped with tests, and even covered for each other if someone got in trouble. Without a second thought, I replied that I was in. At first, it was everything they promised. I passed my chemistry test, and I couldn't help but feel grateful for the cheat sheet Kara had slipped to me before the exam. It wasn't a blatant offer, just a quick handoff in the hallway when no one was looking. When I forgot my history paper, another member distracted the teacher while I sneaked out to grab it. I felt invincible, like I was part of something powerful. But soon, things started to take an unexpected turn. "Prove your loyalty," Kara said one afternoon, sliding a folded note across the lunch table. Inside was a list of tasks, starting small, like sneaking into the teacher's lounge and leaving a note in the principal's office. Apparently, I did it, narrowly avoiding getting caught. But as the weeks passed, the tasks grew riskier. One night, I got a text from an unknown number. "Meet us at the park. Midnight. Don't tell anyone." When I arrived, a few members were waiting. They handed me a spray can and told me to vandalize a local business that is a direct competitor to one of the members' family-owned tutoring centers. I hesitated, but they didn't take no for an answer. "This is how we protect and look out for each other," Kara said. "Do this, or you're out. And if you're out, you pay the price." By the time I realized what I'd gotten myself into, it was too late. The society wasn't just about helping each other. It was about control and domination, forcing people into actions they wouldn't normally consider. I started noticing patterns. The people they helped were suddenly in debt to the group. Students who tried to leave found themselves with a ruined reputation. The society had made sure they kept everything under wraps. No one could ever pin anything on them because they controlled all the evidence. Kara and a few others had a tight grip on everything. It all came to a head when they asked me to sabotage the school's student elections. One of the society members had a personal issue with a candidate running for class president, and they wanted me to ruin their campaign. They gave me a fake email account and told me to send out an anonymous message spreading lies about the candidate, making them look dishonest and untrustworthy. I knew that if I went through with it, it would not only destroy someone's reputation, but also set a dangerous precedent for the type of person I was becoming. I decided to confront Kara. "I'm out," I told her one day after school. She smirked. "No one just leaves, you know that. You're either with us or you're against us." I tried to walk away, but she stopped me with a chilling threat. "If you leave, I'll make sure your reputation is shattered beyond repair. You'll lose your friends, everyone's trust, and any future opportunities." I was trapped. But it dawned on me what I needed to do. Over the next few days, I secretly gathered evidence, texts, notes, anything I could find. I knew I needed leverage, and then I finally decided to go to the school counselor. It was terrifying, but that was my last option. With the evidence I'd collected, the administration launched an investigation. Kara and the others were furious when they found out. For weeks, I couldn't walk down the hall without feeling their glares. Some of the members were expelled, Kara was among them, others faced suspension. As for me, I also got a few days suspension for my previous actions. When I met Emily for the first time, she seemed like a friendly girl trying to fit in, like everyone else. It was the first week of school, and I was still getting used to the new environment. But Emily was different. She seemed so confident, so welcoming, like she had everything figured out. She reached out to me the way people wish they could reach out to others. I felt like I found a genuine friend. Just to mention, I am also a girl. At first, everything was perfect. We'd hang out between classes, walk to the cafeteria together, and chat about anything and everything. She seemed to be the type of person everyone wanted to be around, smart, funny, and always with the right thing to say. I admired her, and I guess that's why I didn't see the warning signs. In the beginning, it felt like Emily just enjoyed my company. She'd call me after school, asking if I wanted to hang out, and we'd do things like grab coffee or go for walks in the park. I liked it. It was nice to have someone to talk to who didn't judge me. But soon, I started noticing small things that made me feel uneasy. One afternoon, I was at the mall with a couple of other friends I had met. Emily was with me, but as soon as we bumped into some people from my class, she seemed to change. She went quiet, hanging back, and I thought maybe she was just having a bad day. But as we continued to shop, I caught her staring at me whenever I talked to someone else. It was subtle, but enough for me to feel like something was off. The next day at school, she confronted me in the hall. "Why didn't you tell me you were going out with them?" she asked, her voice low but intense. I tried to laugh it off. "It was just some friends from class, nothing special," I said. But Emily's eyes didn't soften. She kept looking at me, almost as though she was offended that I'd spent time with someone else. At first, I didn't think much of it. I had been hoping to make friends, and I convinced myself that Emily was simply being caring, nothing out of the ordinary. But soon, her behavior began to take a more troubling turn. She began showing up everywhere. If I was talking to someone after class, Emily would magically appear beside me. If I went to the library to study, there she was, sitting at the desk next to mine. At first, I thought it was sweet that she wanted to spend so much time with me, but then it started feeling suffocating. One afternoon, I was walking home from school with Emily when I bumped into Matt, a guy I had been talking to. He was friendly, and we had shared a few laughs during lunch, but we hadn't really hung out much outside of school. Emily, however, didn't seem pleased to see him. As soon as I said hello, her expression changed. It was like she was upset that I had spoken to him at all. "You're walking with him?" she asked in a sharp tone. I was caught off guard. "It's just Matt," I said, trying to keep the mood light. But Emily's eyes flashed with anger. "I thought we were going to hang out, just the two of us," she said. I tried to reassure her, but the tension was clear. That night, Emily texted me, asking why I had talked to Matt. I felt guilty, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. I texted back, saying it was no big deal and that I'd talk to her the next day. But her responses became short. She accused me of avoiding her, of spending time with other people behind her back. I tried to explain, but it was clear she wasn't listening. The next few weeks were a blur of tension and confusion. Emily's behavior grew more possessive. She would text me all day, checking where I was, what I was doing, and who I was with. She'd even show up at my house unannounced, claiming she had nothing else to do. I started to feel like I couldn't breathe. Every time I tried to hang out with someone else, Emily would react like I'd betrayed her. I began to pull away, which only made things worse. One day after class, I told her I needed some space, that I had other things to focus on. Emily didn't take it well. She was furious and began saying curse words to me. The next few days were the worst. Emily became unpredictable. She would smile at me one moment, then glare at me the next. She started spreading rumors about me, telling people I had been ignoring her, that I was rude and ungrateful for all the help she'd given me. I hadn't done anything wrong, but somehow I felt like I was the one who was to blame. It wasn't just frustrating, it was terrifying. Then came the next thing she did that made me finally cut ties with her. I was sitting in my room trying to finish homework when I received a message from an unknown number. The message read, "I know what you're doing. If you don't stop hanging out with them, you'll regret it." I froze. I knew instantly that it was Emily. My stomach dropped as I realized just how far she had gone to control me. I was terrified. I knew I had to get away, but I didn't know how. I tried to distance myself further, avoiding her as much as I could, but Emily wasn't done. She had become obsessed. I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with a bad friend. I was dealing with someone who would stop at nothing to make sure I didn't leave her. I decided to talk to a teacher about what had been going on, hoping they could intervene. I explained everything, how Emily's behavior was getting out of hand, how I was scared. The teacher was supportive and warned me that Emily had been involved in some troubling incidents before. Apparently, she had a history of being involved in this type of troubling incidents before, and she had even been suspended from her old school for similar behavior. Eventually, I found the courage to tell Emily that I needed to cut ties with her for good. I wasn't sure how she'd react, but I knew I couldn't keep living in fear. When I told her, she just smiled and said, "You'll regret this." It's been months since I cut her out of my life, and things have calmed down. Now, whenever we cross paths, we pretend the other doesn't exist. We pass each other in the halls like strangers, avoiding eye contact, as if those intense, turbulent months never happened. I've learned that some friendships come with a cost you might not be able to afford, but I'm still haunted by what I went through. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't spoken up. Would I still be trapped in that toxic friendship? I don't know, but I do know this. I will never let myself get that close to someone who's controlling again. It was the last day of exams, and everyone at Westwood High was buzzing with excitement for the start of summer break. The final bell rang at 2:30 p.m., and the halls erupted with the noise of students pouring out of classrooms, eager to escape. I should have been one of them, but instead, I stayed behind to finish a project for history class that I had completely forgotten about. By the time I left the building, the school was practically deserted. Only a few cars remained in the parking lot, and the distant hum of a lawnmower drifted from the maintenance shed. My parents were supposed to pick me up, but when I checked my phone, there was a text from my mom. "I'll be arriving late. Please wait inside the school for me." Annoyed but understanding, I plopped onto a bench near the entrance while I scrolled through my phone to pass the time. Every now and then I glanced up at the parking lot. It felt unsettlingly empty. Around 3 p.m., I noticed a man leaning against one of the few cars still parked near the far edge of the lot. He wasn't anyone I recognized, definitely not a teacher or staff member. When I looked up a second time, he had moved closer, now standing just a few spaces away from my bench. I pretended to be engrossed in my phone, hoping he'd take the hint and go away. "Hey kid," he called out. I didn't respond. "Hey," he said again, louder this time. I glanced up, and he smiled, an unsettling too-wide grin. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice casual, as though this were a normal question. "No, thank you," I replied quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. He took a step closer. "You sure? It's hot out here. You don't want to be stuck waiting all day." I stood up, my heart pounding. "I'm fine. My ride is almost here." I started backing toward the school doors, trying to look confident even though my knees felt like jelly. That's when I realized the doors were locked. The janitor must have locked up after the last of the staff left. The man noticed me pulling on the handle and tilted his head, his grin widening. "Guess you're stuck, huh?" "Leave me alone," I shouted, hoping someone nearby would hear. He raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, no need to freak out, just trying to help." But his eyes told a different story. They were cold and calculating, and he wasn't leaving. Panic surged through me. I turned and sprinted around the side of the building, heading for the back exit near the cafeteria. I knew there was a small alleyway behind the school that led to the main road. As I rounded the corner, I glanced back and saw him following me. He wasn't running, just walking briskly, as if he knew I couldn't escape. I reached the cafeteria doors and yanked on the handle. It was locked, Smart, he called out, his voice echoing across the empty courtyard. Running just makes it more fun. And then, I spotted a stack of cafeteria chairs someone had left outside, grabbed one and held it in front of me like a weapon. "Stay back!" I shouted. He laughed, but he didn't come any closer. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. Suddenly, I heard a car horn blaring from the parking lot. Without thinking, I bolted past him, keeping as much distance as I could between us. The man didn't follow me this time. He just stood there, watching as I ran toward the car. I jumped into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut, and yelled for her to go, my voice shaking. My mom looked confused but obeyed, pulling out of the lot and onto the main road. When I finally caught my breath and looked back, the man was gone. I immediately told her everything. Her face turned pale as I recounted how the man had tried to grab me, how he claimed to give me a ride home. She didn't waste a second. We drove straight home and called the school to report the incident. They assured us they'd look into it and promised to check the security cameras. But when they reviewed the footage, the man hadn't been caught on any of the cameras near the entrance. The school took action right away, implementing new safety measures, locking the parking lot gates after hours and ensuring no students were left waiting alone outside. My mom made sure I never stayed late after school again. And every time I pass that empty parking lot, I can't help but wonder what might have happened if my mom had been just a few minutes later. I've always stayed late after school. Between being on the track team and trying to keep up with my grades, the quiet surroundings of my school became my second home. But if I had known what would happen that Friday evening, I would have run out the second the final bell rang. It started like any other day. Practice had ended, and the rest of the team headed out. I stuck around to grab my science textbook from my locker. The halls were completely deserted, lit by a strange yellowish glow from the aging fluorescent lights overhead. I reached my locker near the far end of the east wing, right by the art department. The school was silent, except for the faint hum of the lights. My footsteps were silent because I was barefooted. Just as I reached for my combination lock, I heard something behind me. A quiet shuffle, followed by a faint clink of metal hitting the floor. I froze. The East Wing was known for being creepy after hours, but I told myself it was probably the janitor. I turned around, but the hall was empty. Shaking it off, I reached to spin the lock on my locker. That was when I heard faint whispers coming from the direction of the principal's office. I stopped and listened. It wasn't my imagination. There were low voices, and then a rustling sound like someone going through papers or drawers. Curiosity got the better of me. Hugging my book tightly, I tiptoed toward the office, staying close to the wall. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I saw two men wearing dark clothing. One of them had a faint flashlight and was rummaging through the principal's desk. My breath caught in my throat. I immediately tried to leave, to get far away enough to make the call for help. But before I could take a step back, my foot accidentally kicked a loose pen lying on the floor. The sound echoed down the silent hallway. "Did you hear that?" One of them whispered. "Yeah, check it out." I didn't wait for them to find me. I bolted towards the entrance, but before I made it halfway, I heard a loud clang. Something hit the lockers behind me with a metallic thud, ricocheting off the surface and landing on the floor. I didn't look back, I just ran. Reaching the main entrance, I pushed on the doors and burst outside into the cold evening air. My track coach, Mrs. Daniels, was still in the parking lot. She turned as I sprinted toward her, gasping for breath. "What happened?" she asked, her face etched with concern. "There are thieves in the principal's office," I replied. Mrs. Daniels didn't waste a second. She grabbed her phone and called the police. Within minutes, sirens filled the air. But by the time the officers entered the building, the men were gone. They had left behind a mess in the principal's office, drawers pulled out, papers scattered everywhere. Later, we learned why they had been there. The principal had recently organized a charity fundraiser and had left a large sum of cash locked in the school safe. Thankfully, they hadn't managed to break into the safe before they fled. The police found the object they had thrown at me in the hallway. It was a small crowbar, the same one they had likely used to break into the office. That night, I was still in shock that I didn't sleep a wink. And while I still stay late after school sometimes, I never wander down the East Wing alone. Please do not forget to subscribe, like, and share to your friends and family. We appreciate your efforts.